Ephesians chapter 5, we're going to begin here in verse 22 in a minute, but I want us to be reminded of where we have come from. And this will, I think, be the last time we talk about walking as we work our way through. Paul has already laid out all of the walkings, but if you're visiting, you're here with family or just visiting from around town, we have noticed that throughout Ephesians, 6 times Paul talks about walking. And what that means for us is when we are walking, that is kind of a daily life kind of thing. It wasn't something chosen for exercise or to get your steps in or any of that stuff back in their day. It was to get from place to place, to live regular life. And so when he talks about walking, he talked early on about walking in good works. So one of the things that characterizes our walk as Christians is we're doing good things. We talked about walking in a worthy manner in Ephesians 4, which is to say you carry the name of Christ. And so because of that, because of what you represent, you should walk in a way that's worthy of that. We walk with purpose. So we're not walking around aimlessly with nowhere to go. We have something to do, something God has planned for us, those good works that he already talked about. We talked about walking in love. So the things that we do, the way we act, how we are with one another should be characterized by love. We talk about walking as children of light. So we, again, represent God with that worthy manner. There's an inheritance that comes because of that. And so we want to walk in such a way that shows we value all of those things. And then last time we talked about walking in wisdom. We can choose foolish things, and I don't think we ever would say that or want to do that, but we also have all made foolish choices, haven't we? And so we want to be people who are acknowledging the choices before us and walking as people who are wise, not as people who are unwise. And then we unpacked that a little bit last time as we closed, which is what walking in wisdom looks like. And so first of all, it's communicating in positive ways. You are surrounded by negativity. I mentioned at the beginning of our worship time, the 8 of Facebook groups that I am on, not everyone on those groups communicates in positive ways. I don't know what that's all about. Maybe you have experienced this online where people, for whatever reason, maybe it's because they're not face-to-face, don't communicate positively. And you've probably experienced that face-to-face too, where people are very negative or fault-finding with you. Secondly, walking in wisdom means that we give thanks regularly. And so Thanksgiving was a neat thing on Thursday where we've had too much turkey and all of that. But hopefully we don't wait for one Thursday in November every year to be thankful. We should be thankful all the time for what God does for us. As was mentioned on Wednesday night, that we give thanks constantly, pray continually. In all circumstances we give thanks. And then third, it is selfless and humble. So it's not about me, it's about how this affects everyone around me, how I interact with them, how I make their lives better. I'm not going to be constantly caught up in what I think, kind of as Jet talked about in class this morning. We're going to be concerned about discerning for ourselves, not necessarily discerning for everybody else. And so why do we say all of this? Because the context of where we're going is important, because we tend to get tripped up here. Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 22, wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. And now someone who is visiting with family is elbowing family saying, did you really bring me here on the submission day? We're going to talk about submission. I don't want to hear about that. And our reasoning for that is because of what we have done with submission in 2022 in America. I think the Preaching the Word Bible commentary puts this really well. He says the text teaches that there is a divinely given order that in the marriage relationship and uses the word submit, which is an incendiary word in today's Western culture. I like that word incendiary. When you hear submit nowadays, immediately it causes emotions of some kind. And I've watched this online a lot of times too when this word gets used, where people just immediately have all these feelings that come with submit because you tend to think of, in the lens of our time, the negatives. And he unpacks it a little more this way. This is the age of liberation. When I went to Oregon, I was told a lot by people in Oregon about the independent spirit was a value in Oregon. That everybody had this spirit of independence, they're all doing their own thing, and so sometimes that makes church a little bit of a struggle because you have to lay some of that down. It's not just Oregon. We have that all over the place. We have this independence about us. It's the age of liberation. Talk about submission is today seen as countercultural and connotes for many putative synonyms like oppression, subjugation, or dominance. Now, I would submit to you this morning that when Paul says submission, he's not talking about oppression or subjugation or dominance. He is talking about a very different kind of relationship within marriage. So if you heard the word submission when we started, or you're watching online and you heard it, and you immediately just kind of cringed your teeth a little bit and you felt yourself get a little more tense, take a deep breath and realize that submission, the way that we see it in the lens of our world and the way it's portrayed, is not what Paul was talking about. Paul is not talking about being demeaning or oppressive or anything like that. Paul is talking about a very godly relationship, and you'll see that in the way he describes it. So he's not talking about oppression or subjection or dominance. So verse 23, for the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. So he talks about Christ and the church here. And when you think of Christ and the church, those three words from the definition from the commentary don't come to mind, do they? Suppression and objugation and dominance. That's not how Christ treats the church. That's not what he's about. That's not the church he laid his life down for. And although there is a clear head and a clear submission going on, it is not a negative relationship. It is a relationship of order. And if you were to go all the way back to the beginning in Genesis, and we mention this from time to time, and maybe this is another Bible theme that's beginning to sink into us, God is constantly bringing order out of chaos. And so you have probably, at some point in life, seen marriages that look like chaos. You may have been at some point in life a part of marriage that looks like chaos. Maybe your marriage has grown from that chaotic time into something different, and maybe every now and then, can we talk about this on Thanksgiving weekend when all the family is here? Maybe every now and then family still becomes a little chaotic. I remember the first time I went to a big holiday meal with my wife's family. It's running exactly the way it's supposed to, but to me, there are far too many people. Because a big family meal for me growing up was if my aunt and uncle happened to come and there were 6 of us instead of 4. And that was it. That was big. And even then, it was still about 98% my grandmother in the kitchen cooking everything, and about 2% my mom doing things with my grandmother coming behind her to correct the thing that my mom was doing because it wasn't the right way. And I walk into holiday meal at my wife's family, and there's just people. And they're all doing all this stuff. And to me, it looks chaotic. But the more times I've been there, I've realized it's not chaotic. This is how it all works together as family. And so God recognizes in us the tendency, if we're not careful, for things to get a little bit out of order. And here in Ephesians 5, he provides for us order. It's not dominance, it's not subjugation, it is submission, and as we're going to see from the side of the husband here in a moment, it is love. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So it is love from the husband's side. There is love and there is submission. Now, if you think of, again, those terms that our world uses today, subjugation and dominance and those kinds of things, love doesn't come hand in hand with that, does it? When you think of times in our world where you have seen or experienced that type of relationship, it's not loving. It's all about power and struggle and who's going to get their way. And God says to us through Paul here in Ephesians, that's not how marriage works. Now, most of us, if we're honest with ourselves, have probably had a time somewhere along the way where those kinds of things at least simmer. And sometimes they come above simmering and they really take precedent in the relationship. And God would keep guiding us back to this: submission and love. Christ in the church. This is how things should look for us. Verse 26, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of the water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So it's not just love, it is a love that is sacrificial, because that's how Christ loves the church, isn't it? Christ views the value of himself, and at the same time realizes what he must do for the church, to present the church the way that God would have the church presented, to save the church the way that God has designed for the church to be saved. He is going to love in a way that is sacrificial. And then notice that he mentions here the leaving and the cleaving and then becoming one flesh. So we have experienced probably some of that within the course of the last week too. We have had times where all of these new one fleshes have come back, or maybe you have gone to visit them, and you have that family time together again, and every now and then there's a little bit of a clash, isn't there? Because there are these new family and the old family, and everybody's trying to make these things work, and God sets in order here that now what takes precedent is that new family. They are now one flesh. And that's a struggle, isn't it? You know, I figure there will come a time for us in our house at some point where our boys decide to get married and somebody gives in and goes for that. And we'll have to learn how to adjust to all that because we do things the right way now. And they should continue to do things the way that we do them. And then God recognizes, well, there's a challenge here because now they're going to begin building their traditions. And somewhere down the way, their kids will be building their traditions. And each time these new families work as themselves, and then gradually that spreads out a little bit to work with one another. The mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. So he talks about this mystery, and this is, by the way, a little too far. Where are we at? Oh, go back. There we go. Okay. He talks about this mystery. And this is where we will come back to in a couple weeks, I think, because I noticed as we were going through, it's not just walking that's going on in Ephesians. There are also several mysteries that are going on. So I guess I'll leave you with the mystery this morning of where we're going with that. We will come back to the mysteries in Ephesians. Maybe if you like Bible study, you might go look at some of those mysteries in Ephesians and see what God is doing. But this is mysterious, not just in the sense of the family tends to be a mystery in that dynamic sometimes, but what God is doing in his plan. Okay, now we'll try to go to verse 33. There we go, perfect. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. Now, he spends a lot of verses on marriage, and I think there's a reason for this, because it kind of starts there, doesn't it? If you get your paycheck at the beginning of the month, I don't know when everybody's paid. I know when we were in Searcy, we had a lot of Harding employees at church. They all got paid once a month. When you get that paycheck at the beginning of the month, you have an order of things that are to be paid. Now, I like to think in a perfect world because I'm the preacher and we're here and that table's right there and the trays come back and all that. The first thing you think of is, okay, what am I going to give on Sundays? But I'm realistic enough to know probably everybody doesn't go there first, or maybe that could be a challenge for us too. If you think in terms of the bills that must be paid, not in terms of just the giving, usually where you will begin is where you live. If you still owe on your mortgage, if you have rent, whatever that may be, you will start with that, and then you'll begin working your way from there. Because quite honestly, your PEC bill, sorry PEC folks, doesn't matter if there's no house to power, does it? And so if you're on time with your power bill all the time and your rent is 6 months behind, something's out of whack. God sees that within our relationships, and so he begins at marriage because it's kind of this core relationship for those of us who are married. And then he builds out from there. And so he keeps coming back to this idea of the submission and the love and the sacrifice and what that looks like, and he brings it all together with, it is sacrificial love and submission, or maybe another way of thinking of it is love and respect. And again, think back to those words that we tend to define submission with nowadays. Because when you think of subjugation and when you think of dominance, that does not build respect, does it? Have you ever had someone within your family that tries to rule that way? Maybe you had a parent that was like that. Maybe you're married to somebody who's like that. Maybe somewhere in life you have had a boss who is like that. It's a struggle, isn't it? Because when you feel like you're being put down, respect is not what comes to mind. And so Paul says to us, if on the one side you have love and the other side you have respect, then it works. And I think quite honestly what you will find is if on one side you have love and the other side you have respect, you also have that coming back around the other way. And you will have love coming from the wife and respect from the husband as well. And it will just continue to circle and circle around this design of God's order for our married lives. And so if you're not married and you think, I've had enough of this, there's more. He moves on from marriage to the next thing. Children. Kids, listen up. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. See, it was not our idea. It was God's idea. Obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. And then he repeats an Old Testament idea. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. So this obedience is for purpose. There's something that comes with it. If you obey and you honor, then things are going to go well for you. So we want for children to obey and to honor parents. And clearly from the parent side, this is easy to say, but from the kid side, there is reasoning behind this. And notice there also, by the way, in the Lord. I know there can be a struggle sometimes. All of these things, I believe, are written within a Christian context. And anytime we take any element out of this that is not the Christian context, it becomes eminently more challenging. And if you live within that sort of family, I think you know that already. I don't have to tell you that. And we still need to be people who are trying to move toward this goal. But for us as Christians, clearly, this is core of who we are. And so for kids, I would hope that your Christian parents want the best for you and obedience would make sense. Although we don't always get it right and sometimes we mess up. On the other side of that, in verse 4, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So you'll notice again, like with the husband and wife, with the father, with the parent and child, there's kind of a give and take here, isn't there? There's a responsibility on both sides. And for whatever reason, we tend to emphasize one and not the other. I mean, how many times have you heard in churches of Christ at this point in life, wives submit to your husbands? And I'm guessing a lot of wives are going, a lot of times. How many times have you heard husbands love your wives? Probably not as many as the first. How many times, kids, have you heard children obey your parents, honor your father and mother? A lot of times. How many times have you heard fathers do not exasperate your children? Probably less times. They're the ones with the microphone, so you don't hear that as much. So what does it mean to do not provoke or do not exasperate, depending on which version of Scripture you've got? I think, again, the Preaching the Word Bible Commentary explains this pretty well, so I want to give you his list. First of all, unreasonableness is provoking. If you are unreasonable with your kids, you're not prodding them with a stick kind of provoking, but it's doing kind of the same thing mentally, spiritually, all of those things. So for those of you with many kids, let me let you in on a hint if you have not figured it out yet. They're all different. They all have different ways of thinking, different things that work and don't work, and you learn that probably when they're small. When David was a little guy, if he cried at night in his crib, I could pick him up and he would stop crying. When Nathan was a little guy, if he cried at night in his crib, I could pick him up and it was like I was not even there. And he just continued crying at exactly the same volume, sometimes louder, because who is this guy who's bothering me? And where is my mom? And so I could hand him to his mother. He was fine. They're different. When they got a little bit older and it became, punishment and motivation and all of those things, different things with different people. They have different talents. For me to expect Nathan to do a thing that David is good at, it's not always going to work. Vice versa is not always going to work. So I cannot be unreasonable with what I expect. Luckily, I never am, right, Nathan? Nod really big. Okay. Secondly, fault finding. We don't want to just constantly be looking for the I told you so moments. Look, you've messed up. How awful is that? You really should do better next time. You're just not very good. And even when you're not saying all those things, that's what they're hearing. Because honestly, a lot of us have been on the other side of that, have we not? Have you not? Do you still, even adults, even grandparents at this point, do you not still have one or two from your parents or grandparents growing up that are just right there in your mind? And a situation comes up and it's immediately there again? Or if not a grandparent or a parent, maybe a teacher, some other authority figure, and you have that moment you can remember? Third, neglect. This is probably one of the greatest places where we suffer in our world. You cannot neglect your children, even if they are not within your home. For those of you who life has not gone in that direction, you cannot neglect your children. And then fourth, inconsistency. They have to know what to expect. They have to know, well, this is what's going to happen if this happens, and why did this happen this time and not this time? And even between kids, there has to be consistency there. So do not provoke by doing these things. And instead, give discipline and instruction. And to do that, by the way, in the way we've been reading throughout Ephesians 5 and 6, in love, in the Spirit, in the way that Christ loved the church, when we look at the marriage relationship or the way God loves us, we have discipline and instruction. And that looks like, if we want to find a way to label that, obedience and nurturing. The children obey, the parents nurture. And when you have that relationship, it works. When you don't, it doesn't. Then lastly, bondservants and masters, which just rubs us the wrong way every bit as much as submission sometimes because of the lens we look through. Think of this in terms of employer-employee because that's the relationship we have now. Also, if you're visiting, we talk about this a lot here. When slavery comes up in Scripture, we don't find God commanding slavery, saying slavery is a good idea, anything like that. What we find is God writing Scripture into a world that has it. And so he tells people how to behave within that context, knowing that if you love your neighbors yourself, there's only one way that goes at some point. And so he's patient with his people to get there. Bondservants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart as you would Christ. Not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man. So he says, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or is free. So obey and serve well. If you're an employee, obey and serve well to the bosses who are over you, whether they're watching or not, whether there's a consequence that comes with it or not. You just do well, do the right thing. And again, like all the others, if you're on the flip side of that and you were the boss, you were the one in charge, he says this, masters, do the same to them. And stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him. So if you're a boss, be a good boss that treats people well. Be kind and be humble. I don't think I've mentioned to you, and we're about to bring all this together, by the way, I know I'm a minute or two over. I don't think I've mentioned to you the worst job I've ever had. Not a ministry job, by the way, so you'll start wondering which church. When I was out of college, the first time, not finished, trying to figure out what to do with life, all of that stuff, I worked for, I believe, about a month, maybe a little less than that, at a ladies' clothing store. Yes, that's right. It was, even applying for it, I thought, do I really want to do this? Now, understand what my job was at the ladies' clothing store was they would get shipments of stuff in, all the latest fashions that I'm so well versed on. They would get all this stuff in, and they had to have somebody sitting at a computer to enter it all in a computer and scan all the little UPC codes and then go take it out to someone who knew how to display it. And so if you were a lady at the latest clothing store, you would not know I existed. I was always in a back room somewhere at a computer just typing away, unpacking UPS boxes and all that. We would get daily shipments from UPS and other shipping places of all the clothes coming in. And every day I would spend probably 15 minutes holding the door open for the UPS guy. And I thought, this is such a waste of time. Why am I doing this for 15 minutes, multiple times a day sometimes with multiple shipments? Why don't we get this crazy new technology called a doorstop? And so I said to the boss, the guy who ran the store, have you ever considered putting a doorstop on this door? You know, just right down there at the bottom, you kick the thing down. And he said, well, you know, it'd cost too much to do that. And I was like, they're like $6 at the Home Depot. You know, I could run down, I have a drill, I could put it on there. He's like, oh, you can do that? You know, he thought I was a computer guy. Sure, I can do that. And so I went down the Home Depot, I got the doorstop, sat down, you know, measured twice, cut once, all that stuff, sat down, drilled the holes, got ready to go. As I was getting ready to drill the first hole, actually, I'm down on one knee, drill up to the door, and I could feel the boss behind me. And then I feel his head come right next down to my head. And first I smell the coffee before he says a word. And then I hear him say, if you mess up my door, I will mess you up. And I thought to myself, I'm making minimum wage as a 20-something-year-old guy at a ladies' clothing store. And this is not okay. And I finished putting the doorstop on, which worked perfectly until the day I went to pick up my last check, by the way, and probably works fine now for whatever store is now there. And I just said, I'm not here for this. I was here for at least something close to kind and humble. I appreciate the job. It's the only job I have ever quit without a job lined up. I just, not interested. I knew it was not the place for me to be. There's a give and take here too, and it is service on the one side and selflessness on the other. When you are in a position of power, which by the way is the common thread that we have seen at least societally in all of these things, you have to treat that power well. Jesus, who in a position of power comes to earth for us and gives that power up for us. And in turn, we love him to this day. If we work this way within our relationships, where we set aside ourselves and worry about the interests of others, then it all begins to make sense. Because as we read before, we got to this. Submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. This is how these relationships work. This morning, if this is not how it works in your life, let me challenge you, especially in one way. Please do not sit here thinking as we leave, yes, the person I am in a relationship with, husband, wife, parent, child, boss, employee, the person on the other side of that really needed to hear this and fix all of this. Let it be a challenge to you. Let it be a challenge to me that I'm going to be selfless in this and I'm going to look to their interests first the way that Jesus looked to mine. This morning, if you have not experienced this, it is because we live in an imperfect world. It's because sometimes we do lip service to things and sometimes we are just trying to look right on the outside and we don't have our hearts right. But if you submit to the Spirit, as a church, this is what our world will begin to look like. If you will follow Him, be baptized into Him, you can be one of those children of light and walk in that way, and you can see the love that He has already laid down for you. Or if people have gotten in the way, people have frustrated you or let you down or not been these things, don't let those people stand between you and the person who loves you the most. Come back to Him this morning as we stand and as we sing.